April 18, 1945, above Bavaria at roughly 25,000 feet. A formation of American bomber crews scans the sky, expecting the usual threats: prop-driven fighters, flak bursts, maybe a swarm of Messerschmitts diving from the sun. But suddenly, something flashes past their wings, so fast the human eye can barely track it. No propeller, no familiar engine roar. Just a streak, a howl, and then the crack of cannon fire. A gunner later said, "It was like being passed by a bolt of lightning that decided it hated you." This was the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. A machine so far ahead of its time that Allied pilots genuinely believed they had seen a glimpse of the future. In the late 1930s, the idea of an aircraft powered purely by jet thrust felt closer to a fantasy novel than a practical engineering goal. Aviation was still dominated by propellers, radial engines, and machines that strained for every mile per hour they could muster. Yet in laboratories, tucked behind factory doors, and in wind tunnels humming through the night, a small group of German engineers dared to believe that the future of flight could be something radically different. They imagined aircraft not limited by spinning blades or traditional aerodynamics, but driven by streams of fire and compressed air. These were people who were willing to risk their reputations, and sometimes their lives, in pursuit of something that had never been seen in the sky before. Their vision was not born out of desperation, but out of a genuine fascination with what human ingenuity might achieve if constraints were dismissed rather than obeyed. The early prototypes of these engines, however, were anything but revolutionary in practice. They were unstable, unpredictable, and prone to catastrophic failure. During test runs, engineers would sometimes stand behind concrete barriers, peering through small viewing slots as if watching a dangerous animal that could lash out without warning. Turbine blades overheated and cracked, fuel lines ignited, and engines seized so suddenly that the entire rig would shudder like it had been struck. Ground crews, who had to wheel the scorched remains back into hangars, developed a gallows humor about the project. "If it doesn't burst into flames on the runway, it will in the air," they said, half joking, half praying that the next test wouldn't be their last. These were men working under immense pressure, expected to create the impossible with tools, materials, and timeframes that barely made sense. Yet the idea persisted because the dream was simply too compelling to abandon. By 1942, while much of the world still believed the piston engine would dominate the air indefinitely, the airframe that would become the Me 262 stood assembled on factory floors. It looked unlike anything else in existence, the wings gently swept back, the fuselage long and elegant, the twin-engine nacelles poised like clenched fists under the wings. Even without power plants worthy of it, the aircraft radiated potential. Test pilots who saw it for the first time often described a feeling of standing at the edge of the future. They knew they were looking at something that would redefine speed and possibility. If only its engines could keep up. But the engines remained the program's great heartbreak. Germany, strangled by wartime shortages, lacked crucial materials such as chromium and nickel, metals that could withstand the blistering temperatures inside a jet turbine. Without them, engineers were forced to improvise with substitutes that degraded quickly under stress. The result was a power plant that technically worked but degraded after just 20 to 25 hours of flight. Pilots joked that their jet engines were disposable, like light bulbs you tossed away after a few evenings. One veteran pilot recalled landing after a test flight, stepping out of the cockpit, and patting the engine cowling as though thanking a temperamental horse for not bucking him off mid-gallop. Imagine building a Ferrari. Sleek, powerful, beautiful, only to discover that the engine melts after 2 weekend drives. That was the paradox at the heart of the Me 2062's creation. A machine decades ahead of its time tied to an engine that could barely keep itself alive. And yet, despite all these obstacles, the aircraft would go on to take flight. Shocking not only the enemy, but even those who had built it, proving that sometimes the future doesn't wait for perfect conditions. It burst through them. However unprepared the world may be, when the Me 262 finally appeared over Europe in 1944, it was as if reality had skipped ahead a chapter without telling anyone. Allied pilots were trained to expect danger, but nothing prepared them for the sight of a fighter that seemed to ignore the basic rules of flight they had spent years learning. Reports filtered in from shaken aircrews, who insisted they had seen an aircraft with no propeller, no familiar roar, and a speed so startling that it appeared and vanished almost in the same breath. Intelligence officers initially suspected misidentifications, perhaps a trick of the light, perhaps fear playing with perception. But the sightings kept coming, and they all described the same impossible machine. One P-47 pilot captured the shock in his mission log with that famous line, "Enemy aircraft unknown. Characteristics impossible." It wasn't poetic exaggeration. It was the honest reaction of a man who had just witnessed the future streak past his canopy. For bomber crews, the Me-262 was an entirely new kind of enemy. They were used to defending against propeller-driven fighters that obeyed the physics of the age. Fighters that had to climb in wide arcs, that telegraphed their approach with engine noise, that gave gunners precious seconds to swing their turrets into position. But a jet changed that calculus instantly. The Me-262 could climb at nearly 3,900 feet per minute, far outpacing the P-51's already impressive 3,200 feet. Even more astonishing was its top speed over 540 mph, a number that exceeded not just Allied aircraft, but even the expectations of the scientists studying aerodynamics at the time. Veterans later described the jet as a silver arrow that sliced downward from the sky, flickered into view like a mirage, and then disappeared before anyone fully understood what had happened. The first US bomber group to face the Me-262 learned this harsh reality in a matter of minutes. The crews were flying at altitude, maintaining their familiar formation, tight, disciplined, and confident in the firepower bristling from their B-17s and B-24s. They had survived countless missions against flak and fighters, but nothing in their experience matched the ferocity of the jet's attack. A gunner on one of the lead bombers recalled seeing a flash of metal far ahead, assuming it was a friendly escort. By the time he realized it was an enemy aircraft, the jet had already fired its cannons and vanished. "You couldn't track it," he said years later, still stunned by the memory. "You just prayed." What made these encounters so terrifying wasn't simply the Me-262's speed. It was the feeling that the familiar rhythm of battle, spot, react, fire, no longer applied. Gunners were trained to predict the curved approach of a Bf-109 or the spiraling dive of FW-190. But the jet didn't curve or dive. It lunged. It attacked in a straight line, as if pulled by an invisible force, then climbed away with a smoothness that looked unnatural, almost impossible for the era. Some bomber crews described the experience as watching a ghost slip through the formation, untouchable and indifferent to the storm of bullets they threw in its path. And yet, alongside the fear, there was awe. Many Allied pilots later admitted that after the shock wore off, they realized they had witnessed a turning point in aviation. The Me-262 did more than threaten their missions. It rewrote the sky. It announced, unmistakably, that the world was entering a new age where flight would no longer be defined by the spinning blur of propellers, but by the raw, elemental power of jet thrust. The jet's first encounters in combat were brief, violent, and disorienting, but they were also historic, marking the moment when the future finally caught up with the war. Ironically, the Me-262's greatest obstacle was not the enemy pilots who feared it, nor the engineers who struggled to tame it, but the very leadership that commanded its creation. In a moment when Germany desperately needed a defensive miracle to slow the relentless Allied air assaults, the regime instead became consumed with the idea of turning the jet into an offensive weapon. Hitler envisioned the Me-262 as a lightning-fast bomber capable of striking London, Antwerp, or the advancing Allied beachheads in France. He pictured it swooping in at extraordinary speed, unloading its bombs, and vanishing before enemy fighters could even scramble. It was a fantasy built on hope rather than practicality, the kind of vision that might have belonged in a war fought 10 years later with technology Germany did not yet possess. Engineers tried to explain that modifying the jet into a bomber would compromise its performance and delay its deployment. Pilots, who had already flown the early prototypes, begged to keep it as a pure interceptor. Yet the order remained firm, fueled by a leader's desperation and stubborn belief in a miracle weapon that could turn the tide. The consequences of this decision spread far beyond design delays. Every hour spent redesigning the jet's nose to carry bombs, adjusting its center of gravity, and reworking its already fragile airframe meant precious time lost in a war where weeks mattered. Even as the engineering teams pushed back, they were forced to divert their attention from perfecting the fighter version to building something the jet had never been intended to become. By the time the bomber variant was tested, it proved clumsy, unstable, and unable to deliver meaningful payloads. Worse still, the modifications weighed the aircraft down, negating many of the advantages that made the Me-262 revolutionary in the first place. Former Luftwaffe mechanics later recalled how their frustration bordered on disbelief. They knew they had a weapon that could change the air war, but it was being reshaped into a tool that could do little more than drain resources and time. While Germany debated what to do with its groundbreaking machine, the Allies took decisive action. Their intelligence branches had begun picking up hints of a new German aircraft, far faster than anything they fielded. They wasn't sure what it was, but they understood enough to know it needed to be stopped. As a result, Allied bombing raids increasingly targeted the factories producing the jet engines. Those delicate, short-lived turbines that were arguably the Me-262's most vulnerable component. In one particularly devastating attack, a major engine plant was reduced to twisted steel and rubble. Production halted completely. It took months just to restore partial output, and even then, shortages of raw materials meant the engines rolling off the assembly lines were often inconsistent in quality, sometimes failing after just a few hours of use. Because of these delays, political, logistical, and strategic, the Me-262 that could have dominated the sky in 1943 did not appear in real numbers until mid to late 1944, by which time Germany's war effort was already spiraling downward. What might have been a terrifying presence in the air became, instead, a symbol of squandered potential. Pilots who finally received the jet could only marvel at its abilities, while recognizing, often painfully, that they had been given the future far too late to change their present. Despite all its dangers and limitations, pilots who flew the Me-262 often spoke about the experience with a sense of reverence, as if they had been given access to something sacred. Many of them had spent years flying piston engine fighters, machines that rattled, vibrated, and strained at high speed. Stepping into a jet was like stepping into another world. The cockpit shook not with mechanical effort, but with a smooth surge of thrust that felt almost alive. The moment the aircraft lifted from the runway, the pilot was no longer fighting the air. He was slicing through it. Some airmen later said the sensation was so new, so utterly unlike anything they had trained for, that it felt as if the ground fell away rather than the aircraft rising. One Luftwaffe ace, Walter Nowotny, tried to put words to the mix of wonder and disbelief when he told a fellow aviator, "When the jet takes off, you feel you've left Earth behind. You are no longer in a machine. You are the future." For pilots who had witnessed the destruction of their homeland from above, that feeling offered a brief escape, a reminder of the possibility and beauty that still existed in flight. Yet this exhilarating power came with terrifying fragility. The Me-262's engines demanded long takeoff runs, far longer than those of the propeller-driven fighters it replaced. On those long stretches of concrete, as the jet struggled to reach the necessary speed, pilots were heartbreakingly vulnerable. Allied intelligence quickly realized this and instructed fighter groups to loiter near known jet bases. They didn't need to fight the Me-262 in the air. They only needed to catch it during its weakest moment. Over and over, pilots attempting to take off saw enemy fighters appear at the edge of the airfield like wolves spotting an injured deer. Many jets were destroyed before their wheels ever left the ground, turning every takeoff into a gamble with death. Luftwaffe pilots grimly referred to this moment as the walk of death. And for good reason. Every trip down that runway felt like a test of nerves, as much as of skill, each second stretching unbearably while the engines struggled toward the thrust that would finally lift them out of danger. Even in the air, the pilots were never fully free from risk. The Me-262 required delicate throttle control, a trait not ideal for combat conditions. If a pilot increased power too quickly, the engines could flame out, abruptly robbing the aircraft of thrust. But if he increased power too slowly, he risked losing precious speed, the one advantage the jet had over the swarms of Allied fighters hunting it. A P-51 Mustang, though slower, could close the gap quickly if the jet pilot hesitated or made a miscalculation. Many 262 veterans later recalled moments of panic when a tiny mistake in throttle movement created a deadly window of vulnerability, forcing them to nurse the aircraft with a tenderness completely at odds with the ferocious air battle unfolding around them. Flying the Me-262 was, in many ways, like driving a supercar that could outrun anything on the road, but had the handling of a runaway train. It was fast, breathtakingly fast, yet turning at high speed risked tearing the airframe apart. Landing too quickly could damage the fragile engines. Running too hot could burn them out. Every maneuver required precision, discipline, and a calmness few pilots possessed while bullets shredded the sky around them. And still, despite the constant danger, many aviators spoke of the jet with pride and even affection. They knew its flaws intimately. They knew the chances of returning safely were dwindling by the day, but they also knew they were flying a machine decade of its time. A glimpse of a world that would someday become normal. In those brief moments above the chaos of war, they felt what every pilot longs to feel. Not just mastery over a machine, but a sense of touching the horizon of what humanity could become. Historians often return to the same haunting question. What might have happened if the Me-262 had taken to the skies in meaningful numbers just a year earlier? It is a question rooted not in fantasy, but in the technical reality that the jet was ready, at least in concept, by 1943. At that moment, the air war over Europe was reaching a boiling point. Allied bombers were pounding German industry with increasing confidence, while fighter escorts gradually gained control of the upper altitudes. A true jet interceptor entering the battle then, sleek and uncatchable, might have reshaped the rhythm of the conflict in the air. It would not have reversed Germany's fate. The problems on the ground were far too deep. But it could have thrown a long, chilling shadow over Allied planning. The idea of thousands of bombers flying into a sky defended by machines twice as fast as their best fighters might have forced commanders to reconsider the scale or timing of certain operations. Imagining a fleet of Me-262s escorting German bombers or hunting the Great Allied formations brings a vivid picture of the alternate history that could have unfolded. A single Me-262, armed with 430 mm of cannons, and sometimes fitted with air-to-air rockets, could tear into a bomber group with devastating effect. Pilots reported that one good burst could break a heavy bomber apart. Multiply that by dozens, or hundreds, of jets, and the arithmetic becomes sobering. The losses sustained by Allied air forces could have risen steeply, especially before long, range escorts became ubiquitous. A wave of 262s, diving through a formation of B-17s or Lancasters, might have shattered the assumption that air supremacy was achievable through sheer numbers. Even if only a fraction reached operational service, their presence alone might have forced costly tactical changes or delays in major operations, including the air support plans that paved the way for the D-Day invasion. But history is rarely shaped by potential, it is shaped by reality, and the Me-262's reality was tragically mismatched with its brilliance. The jet was simply too advanced for the industrial limits of a nation being bombed around the clock. The materials required for durable turbine blades were in short supply, and without them the engines wore out faster than mechanics could replace them. Even the manufacturing facilities themselves became targets. Allied bombers hit one of the key engine plants so thoroughly that the ruins reportedly still smoldered days later, and production took months to even partially resume. Every delay, every shortage, every destroyed machine pushed the jet further from the moment when it might have made a meaningful impact. Layered on top of these logistical setbacks was a level of political interference that bordered on tragic. Leadership demanded the aircraft be used as a bomber, diverting effort and energy away from its purpose as a fighter at the very moment Germany needed it most. Test pilots struggled with prototypes altered by orders that made little tactical sense, while engineers watched a generation-defining interceptor become tangled in bureaucratic wishful thinking. By the time the Me-262 finally arrived in combat, ready units, the war was already tilting irrevocably against its creators. Airfields were overrun, fuel was scarce, and the skies were filled with Allied fighters waiting to strike at the first sign of a jet warming its engines. And so the great what if never materialized. The Me-262 was too early, too fragile, too mismanaged, and too burdened by circumstances beyond the control of those who believed in it. Yet its legacy survives not in the battles it fought, but in the skies that followed. The jet age sprang directly from its silhouette, its speed, and its promise. A reminder that even a weapon that came too late can still shape the future that comes after the war is over. When the Allies finally stepped onto captured German airfields in May 1945, they expected wreckage, abandoned hangars, and the familiar remains of a defeated air force. What they did not expect were rows of Me-262s resting quietly in the sunlight, their swept wings casting long shadows across the concrete. Some were scorched from hurried evacuations, others half disassembled as mechanics fled advancing troops, but all carried the unmistakable aura of something extraordinary. Engineers and pilots who examined them often paused in silence, absorbing the realization that these machines represented a technological leap no one had been fully prepared for. One American officer famously remarked, "We realized the next war had already been invented," a sentence that captured the uneasy mixture of admiration and shock that rippled through Allied ranks. They were standing among aircraft that had not only challenged them in the final year of the war, but had quietly rewritten the rules of flight itself. The impact of that moment spread quickly once the war ended. Captured airframes were shipped back to Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, their components dismantled, studied, and tested. Engineers who had spent years refining piston engines suddenly found themselves staring at something like science fiction brought to life. These jets were built under desperate conditions, with limited materials and constant bombing threats. Yet their fundamental design principles were revolutionary. Within just 5 years, every major air force across the world was producing jet aircraft heavily influenced by what they had discovered on those German airfields. The United States developed the F-86 Sabre, the British refined their Meteor and later the Hunter, and the Soviets produced the MiG-15, which would become one of the most iconic fighters of the early Cold War. The fingerprints of the Me-262 could be found on all of them, in their swept wings, their aerodynamics, and the very philosophy of jet-powered combat. By the mid-1950s, the transformation was complete. Jet fighters no longer seemed experimental. They were the standard, redefining how nations thought about air defense, speed, and global reach. The skies that had once been dominated by the rhythmic hum of propellers now belonged to the thunderous roar of jet engines. Only a decade after the Me-262 first startled Allied aircrews, these new machines were capable of climbing higher, flying faster, and maneuvering more sharply than anything imagined before the war. And within 20 years, humankind pushed even further, breaking the sound barrier and exploring realms of speed the Me-262's creators could only dream of. Supersonic flight became not just a possibility but a milestone, marking humanity's determination to chase the horizon wherever it led. The Me-262, for all its flaws and limitations, was never simply a weapon. It was a signal, a messenger from a future that arrived before the world was ready to receive it. It came too early to alter the course of the conflict that birthed it, but just in time to guide the shape of the conflicts that followed. Its legacy is not measured in the battles it fought, but in the technology it unleashed, the boundaries it broke, and the imaginations it ignited across nations on the brink of a new era. And so, on that day in April 1945, when bomber crews saw a silver blur rise above them and disappear into the clouds, they were witnessing far more than the enemy's newest weapon. They were watching the dawn of a new age of flight, a moment in history when the sky itself changed, opening the door to a future powered by speed, innovation, and the relentless human desire to go faster and farther than ever before.